Hello, my name is Jan Geisler. I'm one of the founders of the CML Advocates Network, a network of CML patient groups across the globe. And I'd like to speak about generic TKI drugs in chronic myeloid leukemia. What I'd like to cover in this webinar is, first of all, what are generics? Second, which generics of CML TKIs exist today? So what do we know about the efficacy and safety of those generics? What information is available to patients? And what has the patient community done so far on the issue of CML generics? First, to start off, it is important to differentiate between different generics and copy drugs and substandard drugs because they are very much different. And sometimes when you talk about generics, we just mix all the different topics into one, and it's very important to be more precise on this. First of all, the original drug or the originator drug or innovator product is the original drug that is marketed by the company that has developed the drug and holds all the patents. A generic drug is a comparable product that is very similar to the innovator product in dosage, form, strength, route of administration, quality and efficacy, and intended use. The generic drug can only be marketed after the patent and market exclusivity has ended. A copy drug is a drug provided by a third-party manufacturer despite the drug is still patented, for example, because the country is ignoring the patent rules. A substandard drug is a genuine drug product which does not meet quality specifications and due to the difference in isoforms, in isomers or impurities, may lead to a lack of therapeutic equivalence to the original. And then finally, a counterfeit drug is something that is deliberately and fraudulently mislabeled, can be applied to branded or generic drugs, and includes products with correct or wrong ingredients, without active ingredients, with insufficient active ingredients, or with fake packaging. So these different terms are very important to notice, and this presentation covers the topic of generic drugs. First of all, to set the scene, it is important to understand the drug development and approval process of an innovator product. It takes about 12 years or more and about 1 billion investment in euros or in US dollars to develop a drug. There's a 2% success rate, so a lot of compounds are being tested in preclinical and only a very small number of products actually make it to the market. Just to see the process, I won't explain the process in very much detail, but you have a preclinical phase where do a new drug development, first do that in the lab, do animal testing, and once this has been done and the drug is ready for testing in humans, it comes into clinical trials where in different phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, it's being tested in an increasing number of patients to see whether the drug is safe and effective against the disease and is also tolerated well until it can actually be seen as market ready. Then in approval, we have on one hand regulatory approval, so that's the competent authorities that look at the efficacy of the drug, and actually if the drug is seen as safe and effective, is being authorized for marketing. Then secondly, health technology assessment is looking at the cost effectiveness or other factors that actually decide whether the drug is actually being reimbursed. Then the drug is being ready to reach patients. And then in a post-marketing period, after the product launch, there is additional surveillance like phase 4 studies, observational studies, long-term adverse event monitoring and registries and so on to improve the quality of healthcare and improve how the drugs are being used in practice. The equivalence of generics. So it's assumed that the pharmaceutical equivalence is the same. So basically the drug behaves the same way like the original drug. And bioequivalence, it is assumed that the distribution and the metabolization, so basically how the body actually picks up the drug, is equivalent. And if that is a given, it is also assumed that the therapeutic effect is equivalent for the drug. So this is the general assumption, and because of that assumption, it is assumed by all regulators that generics are exempted from long-term and expensive phase 3 studies. So no clinical studies actually to prove the safety and efficacy of the drug, because it is assumed if the pharmaceutical equivalence is there and the bioequivalence, that the let's say, response of patients, and the effect and the toxicity and so on will be absolutely the same. So looking at generics, you can actually see the blue timeline is actually what I presented before. You see in total, with all the preclinical development, very early development, we have about 20 years from the date of filing of a patent and market exclusivity. It's up to 20 years. And you can see the generic company actually skips all these steps because they come in at the very end when a product has been on the market, is approaching the expiration of the patent, and is actually producing exactly the same drug in their own manufacturing, and applies for marketing authorization based on the equivalence data that I've just presented. So that's the reason actually that generics can be launched at a significantly lower price, because there's little development cost. They don't need to do all these clinical studies, which are hugely expensive. They don't need to do basic research. They don't need to do a lot of marketing, because usually the drug has already been introduced by the originator as the original product in the market. So, for example, CML experts know what Gleevec and imatinib are, so they understand what an imatinib product is, even if it's from a different manufacturer. And of course, there's increased competition because there's no patent, so a lot of companies can actually compete for the best price of producing that drug. So there's increased competition, and that's why there's a lower price on the market for generics. Or to put it into the process that I was presenting earlier on, all the factors or all the parts of the process of the production cycle that do not apply to the generics have been crossed out here. So you can actually see generics, of course, need to go through regulatory approval, and they, of course, need to be launched. But all these preclinical and clinical testings, as well as health technology assessment, don't need to be applied to generic drugs. So what's the standard for quality in generics? So when are they being assumed to be equivalent to the original? In tightly regulated markets like the EU or the USA, generic drugs have very strict requirements to be able to be approved on the market. So they need to have the same active ingredient, for example, imatinib. They need to have the same amount of active ingredient, for example, 400 milligrams per pill, and they need to be of the same, the compound needs to be of the same purity, and doesn't allow to be lower quality. The drug actually needs to have the same pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic properties. So they need to be picked up by the body and distributed in the body in the same way like the original product. Then it needs to have the same stability. So when the drug is on the shelf for 3 months, 6 months, whatever, it needs to be as stable and is not allowed to degrade quicker than the original. It needs to have the same mechanism of action, the same safety and efficacy, and it needs to be approved in the very same therapeutic indication, so the same disease and the same prerequisites of disease. It needs to be the same route of administration, so for example, taken orally as a pill. But some differences are allowed, which are mainly due to manufacturing. So, for example, there can be different salts to produce the drug, different excipients, which are actually, besides the active ingredient, additional substances that might, on one hand, facilitate absorption or the enhancing solubility, or might just be fillers to make out of 400 milligram a real pill that patients can swallow. So the excipients might be different. There might be a different manufacturing process to produce the drug, and of course a different product name and packaging. Unless there are no significant difference in the safety or efficacy properties, there's no issue about different salts and different excipients. So if there are differences in safety or efficacy, the manufacturer has to submit further proof of efficacy and safety to prove that this is the same. So more or less, these are the similarities and differences in terms of the products. How are bioequivalence studies being done? So how is being shown that the same amount of active ingredient of the drug is actually delivered into the body and into the cells, is being taken up in the same time, and is also being absorbed by the body in the same time. These are bioequivalence studies, and you can actually see in this chart, you can see on the horizontal side, that's the time in hours, and you can see on the on the vertical of the graph the plasma concentration. So what is the concentration of the drug in the body, in the plasma, in the blood over time. And you can actually see here a blue curve and a red curve. So there's a reference drug and a test drug, and it's being compared, but these two curves are more or less matching the same. And what specifically is important is the maximum point. You can see that here at about 4 hours. That's the maximum plasma drug concentration. So that's where, let's say, the drug in the blood has its peak. This is important for side effects, because the higher the peak usually, the higher the side effects can also be. And the Tmax is actually the time until the maximum concentration is being achieved. And if you look at the area just under the blue and the red curve, that's what they call the area under the curve. And this is actually the exposure that cells have to the drug over time. And this basically needs to be quite the same. And you can actually see in this graph, as the curves are almost matching, of course they're never identical, but quite similar. In this chart, there's no significant difference between both products in terms of blood levels and time. And this was actually a test on generics. You can see also in all of my slides the references at the bottom, where you can see this was, for example, a test of an imatinib generic in comparison to the original. So why do we talk about generics in CML? You can see at this chart that in December, exactly on 21st of December, in most European countries and other countries, the patent and the marketing exclusivity, for example, in European Medicines Agency, expires. So you can see that by 21st of December in 2016, in almost all markets, it will be possible for manufacturers to provide imatinib generics, because the original patent of Novartis has expired, and also the exclusivity to market Gleevec in these markets. But you can see this is not only a case for imatinib, of course, again, because CML was one of the pioneers in providing tyrosine kinase inhibitors or these kind of target drugs. You can see the same happens to other drugs as well. Dasatinib will expire in 2020, nilotinib in 2023, bosutinib in 2023, ponatinib in 2026. And you can also see for other cancers, in lung cancer, in liver cancer, in GIST, and in others, other drugs will also expire in the next couple of years. So the issue of generics is not only an interest of patients taking imatinib, but it will be something that will follow us in CML all across the different TKIs, but also in other cancers. And that's why it's so important that we know about what is happening there. Now, just looking at, for example, the market for it, at the moment, there are about an estimation of 55,000 CML patients in the wider European area of 740 million citizens. Of course, the same applies to the US and many other markets. And the prevalence, that means the number of patients that have or have had CML, is rising rapidly, thanks to the, luckily, the very good survival that we have in CML. Currently, there are imatinib generics already in 10 EU countries, because the expirement date of the patent was different in Eastern European markets, because when they joined the European Union, they had different patent systems at that time. And that's why in these markets, the patent expired already in 2013, while in the Western countries, it is expiring this year. So imatinib generics already in 10 EU countries of approximate 14 manufacturers since 2013. We need to differentiate between central approval, so the European Medicines Agency, which has a mandate all across the EU, has already approved 4 different imatinib generics from Teva, Actavis, Accord and Medac. But there's also the possibility that one member state's authority actually approves a drug, and then other countries are actually acknowledging that approval, which is called mutual recognition. And you can see a number of manufacturers here listed. More and more are coming out. One highlight there is probably Natco, because I'm going to talk later on about Indian generics as well. And Natco has been with VNAT one of the producers of generic or copy drug imatinib for quite some years. What is quite interesting, I mean, people always talk about pricing in the pharmaceutical industry, but it's also important to see that also the generics companies are trying to earn money, and there are commercial companies that are trying to derive a good price for drug, and seeing that probably production of an imatinib pill is probably only some single-digit euros. The prices vary greatly, and you can see some example prices here ranging from 220 euros a month for 400 milligram imatinib per month, per day for a whole monthly period, up to 300 euros in Latvia, 600 euros per month in Lithuania, 1200 euros in Slovenia, Slovakia, Romania, and Estonia, and for example 1400 euros for generic imatinib in Switzerland. You can see in comparison with, for example, I've quoted the German prices of Gleevec and the other second generation drugs, that of course this is a significant price decrease, but still this is not close to production price. There are still significant margins and profits being made also by the generics companies when providing imatinib to the market, taking into account what I've said earlier on, that they basically had zero development costs and very little cost to bring the drug on the market. So there are still quite a significant profit margin on generics here. So where can patients find information about the approval of centrally approved drugs? This is again a European example of the European Medicines Agency. I was just illustrating here how they can be found, because you just go to EMA website and you can see there's a section in the European Public Assessment Reports in the section of human medicines, which provides the background and context of the approval of medicines. And there is a keyword search where, for example, you can enter the name of an active substance like imatinib, and if you click on submit, then you basically see, for example, what is imatinib teva or what is imatinib actavis, and you can see all the details that the European Medicines Agency has produced and provided about about any approved drug by the EMA. And some of the information, all of the information is available in English, but some of that is also available in all the European language, and that's quite helpful. It's a bit difficult to find, but it's quite helpful when an EMA approved drug or generic is being provided to you. But we have also taken action time ago, because we have seen a lot of, let's say, copy drugs of imatinib provided to CML patients, for example, in India, but also in other countries. And so in 2013, we started to build, as a CML Advocates Network, a register, an unofficial register, to not only collect, let's say, the name of the different products out there, but also to collect all the data on the authorization status, on documents provided by the national competent authorities, so by the regulator in each of the countries, and so on. And already in 2014, in a survey that we did to all our member organizations as well as physicians all across the globe, we found out that at that time there were already 63 imatinib products and already 10 dasatinib products, different dasatinib products on the market. Most of them being copy drugs, because the patent, of course, of Gleevec and of Sprycel was still valid, except in those countries where the patent was not enforced. The challenge is, however, that there are not many clinical publications on TKI generics in CML. Clinical means there are, of course, publications about the pharmacological equivalence, but clinical means really comparing how the drug works when you give it on one hand to a group of patients, when you give the original product to a group of patients, and when you give a generic product to a group of patients, then compare how they are doing. So there has been a lot of documentation, because this is what the manufacturers need to provide to regulators. There has been documentation on bioequivalence and bioavailability to regulators, and then also published on the web. But there's hardly, because it's not required for generics to provide that, as I explained earlier, there's not much data on therapeutic and equivalence, because nobody funds clinical trials comparing the original drug with a generic drug. So there's a lack of clinical data. For years, there have been a number of publications on copied drugs, for example, from Egypt, from Morocco, from Iran, from Iraq, from India, and from Colombia. And we have always listed these on the scientific literature list on CML Advocates Network, because we have a list of scientific publications on CML generics on cmladvocates.net. But I would like to highlight some publications that have come out in the past couple of months. There has been one publication from Croatia where Glivec and two imatinib generics were actually compared in terms of plasma levels. One drug or the other drug were given in sequence to real people, and actually then they measured the concentration of the active ingredient in the blood to find out whether this is different to the original. You can actually see here in conclusion of that article in Clinical Lymphoma, Myeloma and Leukemia that the blood levels between Glivec and the other two generics that were tested here was pretty much the same. The blood concentration of one was a bit higher, and you can see actually this little spot in the middle, which is the median, and you can actually see that there was not much of a difference. So the concerns of patients, at least on these two products, that, for example, there would be less active ingredient and less effectiveness against CML, can probably not be seen looking at the data in terms of plasma level on this one. So on ASH 2016, December 2016, just some days ago, there were two interesting presentations, and one of them was of a Polish imatinib generics registry. To remind you, as I said earlier on, in Eastern European countries like in Poland, generics could already be introduced in the market in 2013, because the patent actually expired in these years in those countries. There are currently about 20 imatinibs in Poland. Every hospital themselves tenders for the cheapest product, so they basically go to all the different manufacturers, ask them for prices, and the current price that is established in Polish hospitals is about 5 to 10% of the original Glivec. So that's the current situation. But because the physicians were actually concerned about the effectiveness, they collected data in a registry. So they built the Polish imatinib registry. They enrolled 726 CML patients in 16 centers that were actually given imatinib generics. And the goal was actually to assess the safety and efficacy of imatinib generics in first-line patients, where they now have data from 99 patients, and when patients were switched between different imatinib products, which were 627 patients. So the results presented at ASH, the generics they tested in Poland, Meaxin, Nibix, imatinib Teva, imatinib Polfa, imacrebin and Tilux, seem to be as effective and tolerable as Glivec. Of course, they couldn't directly compare it to the original, but they compared it to historic data from the first-line trials of dasatinib, nilotinib and bosutinib, and from other studies. So they looked how the effectiveness and tolerability would actually be expected. There was no increased switching rate from first to generation TKIs, which also is an indicator that probably there's not more progression or more resistance than under the original. And of course, the analysis is at the moment limited because different generics are being used, because the tenders are ongoing and there's a frequent change. And this was one highlighted as one of the main problems. There's a frequent change of generic imatinibs in a single patient due to frequent tenders for imatinib. So some patients are switched between products every 3 months. The drug choice of the hospital is purely made on price. There are, as it seems, as it was reported, there are no other criteria that are actually being made on approved imatinibs except the price. There was also a second presentation from India on VNAT, which has been a copied drug of imatinib, which has been around in India for a number of years. So they have, in a single institution, single center, they have collected almost 1,200 patients, or data of 1,200 patients on Gleevec, another 174 patients on VNAT produced by Natco. And there was a median follow-up of these patients of 1,300 days. They discovered that the adherence to treatment was equally poor on Gleevec and on VNAT. There was not much of a difference. There was also no observed difference in event-free survival, overall survival, or transformation rates into advanced phases between Gleevec and VNAT. The side effects seem to be quite similar. So in conclusion, the generic and the innovator product version of imatinib showed comparable efficacy and safety in CML. So again, from that clinical observation, there has been no reason for concern for those patients that received VNAT in that setting, in that institution. Also in 2014 at EHA, there has been a report of a single hematological center from Serbia, because in Serbia patients were rolled over from the original Gleevec to Ansovib, as Ansovib was actually listed on the positive list of reimbursed drugs in July 2012. At that time, 220 Serbian patients were on Gleevec, plus 45 patients on Tasigna. The Gleevec patients were all rolled over to Ansovib. So in that center, 55 patients on Gleevec were switched to generic imatinib, to Ansovib. There was close monitoring applied afterwards. In that cohort, 10 patients, about 80%, lost complete cytogenetic response and were then switched to a second generation drug, nilotinib. But of course, the numbers are very small. So it's very difficult to derive conclusions from that. The 15 first-line patients that were receiving Ansovib directly after diagnosing were meeting the usual expectations as they would have expected from Gleevec. There was no huge difference in that. Of course, we as patients have been very aware about the issue because, of course, this is cancer, this is a serious disease, so we wanted to make sure that our concerns about switching patients from one drug to the other doesn't really affect the health, the response, and also the tolerability of a treatment that is life-saving. So that's why we started already 3 years ago to monitor the situation. So we did the survey in 2013 in 55 countries to find out about which products on the markets. In every global CML Horizons meetings, which is the meeting of the leaders of our CML patient organizations worldwide, in each year, 2013, 14, 15, and 16, we actually invited experts to advise us on the topics, and in that we had pharmacologists, we had people from our speakers from the WHO, we had patient advocates, we had clinicians from different countries which had experience in applying generics to CML patients, to make sure we are well informed when we hear from the experts what the issues are. And we also positioned that in the patient advocacy track at EHA at the Congress in 2014. So the topics were generics, copy drugs, substandards, perspective of the World Health Organization's perspective of patients, of hematologists, of pharmacologists, and we try to get the best facts to inform ourselves. So the survey we did in 2013, I highlighted that data a bit recently. You can see on the map actually the blue countries were the ones, including also the red ones, were the ones where original TKIs from the original manufacturers were available, and copy drugs were also available in 14 countries at that time. Interestingly, not only imatinib but also dasatinib. The generics were introduced 8 years ago in India and many more countries since 2013. Results can be found on the link on that slide. We then started at CML Generics Resource Center because it was so difficult to find that information. It was spread all across. Many journals were actually not open access, so we couldn't see the articles. There was a confusion of terms between generics, substandard drugs, copy drugs, and so on. So that's why we started a central resource on the net on cmladvocates.net/generics, where we provided a glossary on generics, copies, and substandards, where we provided this unofficial TKI register, where we listed all the drugs and all the information we had about them, where we started a list of scientific publications on TKI generic and copy drugs in CML, where we also provided all the video streams and PDFs of conference presentations to make sure whatever we presented at CML Horizons, for example, was also available for anyone interested. We also had in a closed section some best practice to provide guidance to CML patient organizations, how they could actually address the issue of generics when being introduced in their countries. So you can actually find that on cmladvocates.net. If you just go to advocacy and knowledge, on the left side there's a menu point CML generics, and that actually lists all the information. You can also directly go to cmladvocates.net/generics. The CML Advocates TKI Register is actually an unofficial register of CML TKIs. Currently there are 5 original drugs and 77 generic or copy drugs listed in it. It's patient-driven, so it's not an official database provided by some authority, but we are collecting all the data we can get and make it available to patient advocates around the world. The main goal is to increase transparency and to provide easy access to generic drug information to advocates. It is a purely non-commercial database, so it's not sponsored by anyone. We're just doing that as volunteers because we feel it is important. The information about each CML drug that is provided in the register, the name of the product, the type of the active substance, the manufacturer's name, the availability, the authorization status by the competent authority, publications that might be there, and the indications, because sometimes it's approved just for blast crisis, sometimes for also pediatric use, sometimes for other indications like GIST. And all these informations are actually available on the TKI register up to our best knowledge. And of course we hope that you provide us with an update if you know that and have more updated information and would like us to update the page. So this is how it looks like. You just click on the link on the website to click on the unofficial register, and you can see it's like an Excel sheet that opens up in your browser, and there you can actually see all the publicly available information, authorization date, indication, link to the regulators' websites, and so on. So that's all based in that register. The TKI Generics Toolbox is just for patient advocates and members of our community, and basically there's some guidance by the CML Society of Canada, which has addressed the topic of CML generics very early, as well as CML Serbia, with tips and tricks on advocacy, for example, how to fight generics drugs if there are serious concerns, or how to address it very rational, how to address different groups, for example, patients, media, and the public. Like I said, there are also web streams from conferences, like from CML Horizons and EHA. On this screenshot, it can actually be seen how that looks like. They're all available as both PDF presentations as well as video streams on CML Advocates Network. Because we thought, and many of us who actually were confronted with the topic of the introduction of generics, we felt there needs to be a patient perspective out there because we have concerns. We are not against generics because generics, also due to lower prices, gives access to more patients. But we, of course, want to make sure that they receive the best quality drug and they receive no substandard drugs. And that's why in May 2014, patient organizations from our network from 58 countries met at CML Horizons 2014 to discuss with health professionals the introduction of generics. And the basic conclusions is that we patients welcome that generics will provide more affordable access to treatment in many countries. But of course, there are concerns, there are worries about the impact on their cancers when switched from one drug to another for non-medical reasons. And that's why we felt there needs to be more clarity and more guidance on this. So what we did is actually we formed a declaration where we called for quality and consistency when generics are being given to patients. So the 5 basic recommendations and requests from the community were that governments and regulators must provide reliable proof of quality and equivalence of pharmacokinetics and bioavailability, because sometimes it is or the regulators or the governments are actually saying that it's equivalent, but they're not providing the respective documents for it. So there must be reliable proof for this. We recommended there should be a collection of comparative clinical data to ensure comparable efficacy, similar to the data we've seen from India and the data we've seen from Poland. More should be done because it's not a general requirement on generics to collect clinical data, but this should be done to make really sure that what patients are getting are as effective as the original. We said there should be no switching for non-medical reasons in optimal response and tolerance. So when patients are on one drug, one TKI, one imatinib, and they respond optimally and they tolerate it well, there should be no reason, for example, commercial reasons, cost reason, just to put them on another product. There should be no switching between products of the same compound more frequently than once in a year to allow consistent follow-up, because how can you track whether there's a problem if the switch between the product of the same active compound actually happens every 3 months? It's very difficult to say is the difference in, for example, side effects and how people feel and quality of life, or even effectiveness of the drug. Can this be tracked down to the product, or can this be tracked down to the biology of the disease and the dynamics? So we said there should be no switching more than once in a year between the product of the same compound. And in the case of loss of response and increased toxicity, we recommended that patients should be given the possibility to switch back or switch to a different treatment. And we also advised that because of the uncertainty after switching drugs, there should be more frequent monitoring in terms of PCR tests, maybe even plasma level testing, to actually give patients certainty that whenever they are being switched, that their response is stable. So these were the 5 recommendations, and the good thing was that the declaration was actually acknowledged by the medical community. So just recently, our recommendations were actually published in Leukemia in the journal, and this can be seen under the link and the publication title actually down here. It's I think a great acknowledgement and success for the community to make sure the patient voice is really publicly available in this open access article. I would like to provide some more details what patient organizations have done in the field of CML generics. And here are just 4 examples from countries where patient advocates have been really active. For example, in Serbia in July 2012, one generic was replaced the branded product, and it was very unclear whether there had been any bioequivalence testing. So the patient organization, in close collaboration with the doctors, suggested to collect clinical data to compare efficacy between the generic and the branded product. This is still ongoing. In Lithuania in May 2013, 7 generics of imatinib entered the market. So in this case, the patient organizations provided legal arguments to the Ministry of Health, arguing that generics are only allowed to be used for GIST by the label, but not for the CML indication. No CML patients in Lithuania have been switched to generic products yet. In Canada, in April 2013, 2 generics replaced the branded product, and patient organizations lobbied for to receive comparable bioequivalence data provided by an independent laboratory. The quality of generic drugs was confirmed in those tests. And then finally in Poland, June 2014, generic applications were filed for reimbursement, but none were approved. The patient organizations complained to government on legal and clinical grounds that quality of generic drugs should first be assessed. The applications, they are still pending. So what are the suggestions for patients? I mean, patients are uncertain, and patients can be given some guidance by doctors or by patient organizations to minimize their individual treatment risk on generics. So what was recommended is to give the patient the recommendation to check if the product and package that the patient is taking is registered in Europe or the USA. This is not so much the case in tightly controlled markets, for example, in the EU, but in some countries it can be helpful to look whether EMA or the US FDA has actually approved the same product in their market, which is being given to that patient in that country. It might be helpful also to track whether there has been any issue with the switch to a generic, to write down the date when they started to take a generic or substandard product. And in that also take some kind of track record of any changes of quality of life on a generic product. Report any serious adverse events or lack of efficacy to your family doctor and your CML specialist at the hospital. And also tell your family doctor that you have been switched to generic products and how many different generics you have been trying already, because sometimes doctors just don't see the full picture, might be spread between different doctors. So have the information at hand and try to collect it and try to write it down. And also be willing to share your experience with your fellow patients community. This is what patient organizations are for, and they can actually better understand the issue if they get the reports from patients about their experience. So it's very important to share your experience with patient organizations. So another 4 potential steps for patient advocates to address issues of substandard drugs. So if you feel there are substandard drugs in your market, monitor what products are in the market and are entering the market. Ask for results of bioequivalence tests before the medicine is registered in your country. Think about your goal, determine your goal, fight for patients' right to receive high quality generics or fight for patients' right not to have this therapy changed. This might be something to be addressed by the patient organizations. Always avoid to act alone. Inform your members of other patient organizations about your goal, and cooperate with doctors, with politicians, addressing them with facts and not with emotions. And of course, be visible. Use mass media, use social media to channel information about your activities, share best practice from other countries and from patient organizations. Sometimes it quite helps to compare to other countries and say in your own country, how could this other country actually do it differently? Why are you doing it like this? So sometimes just comparing it to other countries might also help. And beyond the CML Patients Declaration on Generics, I'd like to summarize this presentation. Quality to control generics have been in some markets since 2013, and most markets will have them by 21st of December 2016. So be sure you differentiate those from poor quality copies and substandard drugs. There will be and there are good quality generics which make no clinical difference to the original product. So don't mix the reports of different countries, different products and so on. So and try to get the facts right and know whether you're talking about generic, substandard drugs, copy drugs and whatever. We as patients and patient groups should not fight in general against generic drugs, because they will be a reality and they also free up financial resources. We cannot just provide more and more expensive drugs. It is important that drugs that have been on the market and have created great profits over many years become generic and are available at a fraction of the price, to free up that money also to develop new innovations and to fund newer drugs which are revolutionizing cancer treatment at other places. We should advocate for good quality generic drugs produced by reliable pharmaceutical companies, but we should not be against generic in general. We should advocate against switching the product for non-medical reasons, so purely commercial reasons, switching from A to B. This is an important issue, and this not only creates the issue of concerns of effectiveness, but also we know from other diseases how confusing it is for patients to get a pill in that box that month, and the next month it's a different box, a different product names, maybe a different shape of the pill, And especially in patients that have to take multiple drugs a day, this is extremely confusing and is risking in terms of adherence and in terms of taking the right drug at the right time. It might really threaten the outcome. So switching for non-medical reasons, and especially frequent switching, as we've seen in Poland, are really problematic. If switching must be done, then it should be done with closer PCR monitoring and observation of side effects to observe and detect changes early. Of course, we know this is difficult because the healthcare system might not reimburse more frequent PCR tests, but this is exactly what we should lobby for, to make sure there is no risk for patients when they are being switched for commercial reasons. And the main reason for the switch is actually for the government to save a lot of money. So it's much, they're freeing up a lot of money, and PCR is not so expensive in comparison. We should still continue to call for comparative clinical data, even though it's not very realistic they will become available at a large scale. But we've seen from Poland, from different other countries, that it is possible to collect clinical data, and this should be done. We should lobby for it. So finally, I'd like to thank everyone who has contributed. First of all, our 112 CML patient advocates member organizations across the globe, but specifically to Zarunas from Lithuania, to Jelena from Serbia, to Nicole from Germany, and Giora from Israel, who've contributed a lot to all the different elements of this presentation. And if you have further questions, please contact us, and please go to cmladvocates.net/generics, which we will keep up to date. The more we know, the more powerful we are. Thank you so much.